Dan, you are live.
Thank you. Good morning and welcome to the, what is today, the October 6th meeting of the Shaping of the Avenue Committee of the East Lansing Planning Commission. All three members of the committee are in attendance and we have an agenda in front of us. Are there any additions or corrections to that agenda? All right, then let's proceed then with item number 2, Shaping the Avenue September 2020 draft. Darcy, did you have some procedure by which you wanted to review this? I've read it again from front to back again and sort of checked against my previous notes and have made some additional notes on this. I suspect we've all done that. Did you want to just go page by page? Or I know that at our last meeting, Chris had some specific topics that he wanted to address. So I'm just asking, I guess, how does the group want to handle moving forward?
Chris,
go ahead.
That would be up to Chris. I'm good going page by page or starting out with Chris's concerns and coming back to the beginning.
My thoughts too. Chris, were there anything particular that need maybe to be addressed before we pick up some of the bits and pieces?
Item 3 is going to cover chapter 2, right? The administration section.
Correct.
So we're talking about things that are not in that.
Correct.
Okay. It looks as though my first comments are on page 13. And I've got some 16, 17, 19, 20 in that area. But does anyone else have anything within the first 20 pages or?
We're talking about the draft that was distributed. So you're talking about what they're calling the building form standards, Chris. So I guess I'm trying to. You're talking about the page of the. Oh goodness. So there's 2 page numbers. There's 2 sets of page numbers. You're talking about the one at the very bottom, right? Or are you talking about the numbers pertaining to the draft of the document? I don't know if that just makes it any clearer.
Yeah,
sorry.
I'm talking about the numbers that are printed on the bottom of the page.
Okay,
that's not the Acrobat page number.
Okay, sure. So it's actually part 4 building form standards is where you're starting?
Yes, that's page 13.
Yep, and I'm calling up another document here. So I'm sort of slightly off center here. Go ahead. I'm listening while I'm looking for this other document.
Okay, this is one of the, I think, very minor ones.
I can pull it up too, Dan, if you need me to do that.
No, I'll because mine has notes on it as well. Thanks.
Okay.
Just a second. Okay.
Got it.
Under 401A.
There we go. Okay. Yep.
The second sentence, there's a phrase there that I'm not too sure we want. It starts out, the building frontage form standards frame the street space. There's no other place in the document we refer to building frontage form standards.
Good catch.
And I'm thinking it could just or should just say building form standards, or is it trying to be more specific in some other way?
No, I think that's a good catch.
And if we change it to building form standards, then it should be in small caps also as a defined term. Then moving on, page 16, unless someone else has things prior to that.
I do not.
On page 16, number 2.
Sorry, Chris, I do have something. I was reading the wrong page numbers actually. On page 15, 8D3 or I know what we're trying to get at here, but that still reads somewhat awkwardly to me. Not to be used to satisfy stormwater best methods and practice area if excluding active tenant use. And when we had talked about that, we were saying that, say, for instance, an open space was created, but that open space was likely to be filled with, if not water, then be extremely wet because it's used as a retention pond. And then that would, by definition, exclude tenant use, right? The idea was that if it were open space and it were used to satisfy this best methods and practices of stormwater drainage, that it would still be available for use by people that didn't want to get their feet wet. I think that language was adopted directly from the beginning, and we've had trouble with it ever since. But
are you saying that it is impossible?
No. I'm just saying that I understand what we're getting at there. My note basically is saying is, should we provide an example? And I don't think that examples are probably appropriate for zoning language.
To me, it seems understandable. I'm not quite sure what
we talked through it enough that just when I read it, it sounded awkward to me. But if I mean, I'm comfortable with what it's saying. If everybody else is, then I'll just let it. I'll get over my discomfort, I guess.
What if, suppose it said something more like, not be used to satisfy stormwater best methods and practices. I'm not sure about the word area there, if that's really necessary, but to satisfy stormwater best methods and practices, if such use excludes active tenant use.
Right. If said, there you go. If said measures exclude active tenant use.
Or maybe, what if it said prevent? Or
sure.
Is that any better than exclude? Or?
I think either of those is fine. I think it gets to the point that you know, it's fine if it doesn't stop people from using it.
Right.
Again, just the way that it's worded right now remains awkward. But I think, yeah, what you've just said, if, you know, sort of if said methods exclude, what did you say? Not exclude, prevent active tenant use. Thanks. I'm going to make that note on my notes here.
Great.
Ready for the next page? Or
yeah, that's fine now.
On page 16, under 2B3, again, this is a trivial one. Any balcony used to satisfy the private open area should be small caps.
Ah.
And the next one I have is on page 17D. Should I go ahead with that?
I don't have anything on 16, Cindy. Okay.
All right, I'm keeping myself muted more often than not because of my dog who does not appreciate Zoom. So I'm listening. I just don't want to subject you to her barking unnecessarily. So.
Okay, this one, it's going to get a little bit more complicated. It has to do with the parking. On page 17D1, let's start with the sentence says, vehicle parking shall be located behind the parking setback line that is generally 30 feet behind the required building line. I don't really care for that phrase that is generally 30 feet behind, because it's not strictly accurate. I think it could be misleading. So I would rather see that out of there. I don't think there's other places where we give a statement of what something might generally be. I'd rather have people just go find what it will actually be for their application than have them. Does that make sense? Or
Absolutely.
okay.
So delete that whole second part.
No, just the well,
The
wait.
parenthetical?
That is just generally 30 feet and just remove generally 30 feet, period.
No, well, it's more than that, because I have a wording suggestion a little bit later in that sentence. So actually, if you delete the entire comma delimited clause, most of the second, well, actually all of the second line. So let me go back to the beginning. It would say vehicle parking shall be located behind the parking setback line, extending, which would be a new word added. And then skip immediately to the third line, vertically as a plane.
Got it.
Okay.
Yep.
But then I was trying to picture how all this works, the parking. And it seems a little bit odd that the code will allow parking to be built into a building on upper floors, as shown in the diagram, but it has to be 30 feet back from the frontage inside the building. That is what it says, right?
That's not what it should say. So in fact, the diagram shows just the opposite. So I'm looking at what you're, is complete and so the ands are tying it all together is what you're saying.
Well, the A, B, and C are exceptions. The general rule is that it is what the first sentence says. It says vehicle parking shall be located behind the parking setback line extended vertically as a plane. That says where it shall be located.
Yep.
And then A, B, and C give an exception that has to meet all three of those to be an exception. So, and the important one there is that it has to be below grade.
Right.
So if you put it above grade, then it has to respect the parking setback line, correct?
Correct. Even if it's on the second or eighth floor.
Yes, exactly. And yet we have another exception elsewhere that allows the parking setback line to be only 12 feet from the frontage if there is a street wall. And in addition, continuing that, if there is a street wall that qualifies for moving the parking setback line, another requirement is that it must have 40% fenestration. So we're allowing somebody along part of their frontage to put in a wall that is, I believe it's 6 feet, it might be 5, it's either 5 or 6, that has 40% openings in it with cars fairly close behind it. And yet if they want to put it up on the second or third floor, they have to put it 30 feet back. Does this really make sense?
And have less, and 20% fenestration at that point.
Yes, right.
So.
And I don't have a suggestion for what we want to do about it. It doesn't seem right.
No, it doesn't. Well, I suspect that I'm not seeing, is it on the next page, Chris, where what you just described regarding parking behind a street wall and moving closer to the building front, that information should probably be in this section, should it not?
I don't know. It's in the tables of placement. Let's see. And I think it's actually in a footnote. Where is it? Okay, it's on, for the M districts, it's on page 20.
Yep.
Under placement, the second line, parking setback line with footnote 2.
Sure.
The parking setback line is reduced to 12 feet where a street wall minimum of 6 feet, and so forth and so on. I think that's the only place that appears, or at least in that level of detail. I don't.
So do you think that the mitigating circumstance here is that there's some sort of obligatory canopy tree that's supposed to serve to buffer? Again, whether that's the right answer or not, I'm seeing that as there's an additional expectation here, is that if it's set within 12 feet, that there would be a tree between the cars and the wall, or the sidewalk at least.
It's definitely intended to mitigate the look of a parking lot, but
right.
The trees could be as far apart as 25 feet, which is about 2.5 or almost 3 parking spaces.
Oh, yeah.
So I'm not sure this is something we can work out right now. Like I said, I've thought about it a little, and I'm not sure what, to some extent, I can't see why we extend the parking setback line within a building up. Because if you, I mean, suppose we set a, what are they thinking? They're thinking that if that's required, then there's going to be offices or retail or something 30 feet deep put in that spot. Is that?
I think they're looking at liner buildings, opposed to what we have a lot of is kind of the open parking. But is that realistic for our downtown?
Actually, maybe you've sussed out the difference here, is that if there's indeed a building in place, that I think that the hope is that it's got, that it's activated with shops rather than a parking structure. Whereas if you've got some exterior space, I don't know that it's the right answer, but that's the seemingly the difference here, is that one's interior parking and one's exterior, and that they're treated differently because of that. Sort of the interior parking needs to be set back, say in this case 30 feet, whereas exterior parking with a screen wall need only be set back 12 feet, or is it 12?
And should it only apply to the first floor where it's set back 30 feet and not the upper floors?
Well, I think that's a different issue, isn't it?
It definitely applies on the first floor as written. If we took out the extending it as a plane, then that would continue that for the ground floor. I guess I sort of see Darcy's point that if you prohibit it even on the second and third floors right at the building line, it does probably help to maintain the streetscape or street frontage. It won't look as though there is a parking ramp right there.
Right. Yeah.
I'm not quite sure how that goes along with allowing a parking lot behind a wall right at street level, because that also interrupts the desired streetscape to some extent.
Right, and I agree with that. With the potential balance here is that the frontage build to, wait a minute, I'm gonna just say this through and then I've sort of thought of a potential exception, but the build to is gonna be 70 or as little as 50, as much as 70 or more %. So that the area that's gonna be potentially impacted by the wall parking, the exterior parking is gonna be no more than 30% of the lot in M4 through M2, and then as much as 50% in M1. And so my exception to that, and I'm sort of thinking, is that, wasn't there not a provision that you could build a street wall to complete the frontage rather than building a building? And now I'd have to go back and check that. But I think that perhaps the provision here is allowing for the fact that the exterior parking, as I'm calling it, is going to be no more than 30% of the overall width of the lot. I'm not saying that that's necessarily the answer, but that they're sort of taking into account that it's going to be, a smaller percentage of the coverage than we might otherwise. So that when you start to build a building around it, then around that parking, the expectation is going to set back a little bit further.
With our current, let's say, covered parking in the downtown, there's none of it that would meet this requirement, correct?
Correct.
Well, I don't know. Maybe it is what we want for now. Now that we've talked it through, I guess I'm not going to push for changing it right now. I just wonder what kind of situations we're going to run into with applications.
I don't know that this is the answer, Chris, but I'm wondering if the differences between a sort of a big parking structure and sort of scattered parking lots where you've got, say, 2 or 3 cars that sit relatively close to the street, as opposed to a big parking structure that potentially could create effectively a blank wall along the what would ideally be a pedestrian way, right? That, if you're talking about really small, maybe I'm going to say no more than, say, 7 cars or so, and I'm just making up a number, as opposed to a relatively long stretch of cars. Like I think about at the corner of Bailey and Albert, the southeast corner. There's not any number of other examples, but in that case, there's a parking structure with apartments above it, right? And that in as much as they're set behind a wall, and of course that wall is greater than 20% fenestration, it's still a parking structure, parking lot that runs right along a pedestrian way, and that it doesn't make for the nicest place to walk. Of course, right across the street from that on Bailey is another parking lot, so that particular stretch isn't pedestrian friendly necessarily, but it would make a difference if that first set of parking spaces were given over to a more active use.
Actually, that raises a question. I don't go by that often. Along Albert Street, is that parking also? For some reason, I kind of picture the building coming down to the ground floor. I mean, apartments on the ground floor.
Yeah, it's funny. I'm picturing it in my mind. There's the entrance is at the corner.
Parking.
Yeah, and the parking definitely goes deep. I just don't know if it's actually got any fenestration along the north side of that lot. Darcy, are you looking at
I believe it does.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, okay.
Not 100% certain, but I'm pretty sure it does.
It's a good catch, Chris.
All right, I guess perhaps we'll leave that as it is right now.
And we probably ought to be ready to address that, you know, because questions will undoubtedly arise. There is a difference between the exterior and the interior parking requirements.
And then I had a note, I guess this is part of the same thing. I had a note on that same page, page 17, just above that under privacy fences, number 4, E, which is the requirement for fenestration in a street wall. That requirement, any street wall above 4 feet in height shall meet the fenestration requirements. That pretty much means every street wall. There's one area where a street wall, I guess in M1, a street wall can be as short as 4 feet. But in M2, M3, and M4, it must be at least 5 feet. This is independent of whether it's screening parking or not. It's just
sure.
And basically, fenestration on street walls is just openings. You know, you're not going to put glass windows in a street wall. I'm looking for the fenestration requirements. I got to go another page.
It's 21.
On the ground story, it's 40% throughout all of the M districts. So every street wall is going to be required to be almost half openings. I guess, again, this is just sort of commentary. If you look at the examples of street walls that are shown somewhere, I forget where they are now. Oh, I think they're in the materials section. There's pictures of street walls, and not a single one of them would meet a 40% fenestration requirement. So they're giving a kind of misleading view of what we might wind up with. And again, I'm not sure what I would do about this if I had total control over the code. Does anyone else have any comments on it?
The only thing that comes to mind for me is that, and I don't know that it's what was at all intended, is that that the street wall takes its fenestration percentage from the upper stories rather than the lower stories. That in that case, it would be as little as 25 and as much as 80. Again, I don't know that that's the answer, but if the intention is that it's supposed to provide some screening and certain amount of privacy for, you know, whether it's to screen cars or it's to provide privacy for the occupants, that would certainly reduce the percentage.
Yeah, that would be one way to handle it. But I think the reason it's written that way, I'm guessing, is that it's trying to maintain a continuity of look with the storefronts. That's why they apply the same fenestration requirement.
You know, and yet, if you take a look at the examples that they give, I don't see that there's a lack of continuity necessarily between the examples that they give, and there's not a whole lot of context, but it's on page 45. Certainly the first two, the upper left and then the upper middle, I don't see that there's a significant break between continuity. There's sort of the one on the upper left's got moss growing on it or vines, and it's got an obvious door in it, but there's definitely significantly less than 40%, less than 25%, I would submit. The bottom right sort of picks up, maybe it's got a little bit closer, but that's because the top is basically let's just say that that's 5 feet tall. the very top foot or so is actually nearly transparent. So they've basically pitched it at 5 feet and then made it effectively 4 feet.
Yeah. If you put a gate in the wall that is solid, that still counts as fenestration, correct? Just like the front door of your store counts as fenestration.
I would think that would make sense.
Although I guess that I think we require that doors be transparent. Certainly in the store frontage, but
I don't recall that.
yeah, I think it's in the materials section for doors, windows, or whatever that is.
Maybe, oops.
No, I don't see it there, but it does say must have a clear view.
It's on page 48, C1.
Mm-hmm. Yep, and D2.
Yep, and D2, yep.
Yeah.
C1,
And D2.
okay, but C1 doesn't say that doors have to have glass, right?
No, I think I just thought that was the section you were referring to, Chris.
Oh, yeah.
Fenestration, whether it's a window or a door.
I'm pretty sure there is a statement in here somewhere saying, I can't find it right now, but I guess that's not critical to this discussion anyway. So perhaps this is another one we don't need to do anything about at the moment. I'm a little bit concerned about using the example photographs on page 48 when, or wherever that now, 45, that seem to perhaps not agree with our requirement, but especially the first one, if somebody were to look at the one in the upper left and think they can put in a street wall like that.
We do have a statement in the beginning in part 1 that states that the photographs may not
Yeah,
depict.
I
Spent a
agree.
lot of time talking about that specific set of photos, I think, as we were talking about that.
Right.
All right, well, I guess we'll move on, or
2 things to consider.
yeah.
Where were we at? 17?
Yeah, I have something on page 20.
I've got something on 19, I think, just a sec. Just in mind, again, this is just sort of comparing my notes to what's written here. On page 19, footnote 1. Again, I'm not sure, I'm not saying that this is incorrect or correct, but I've just a note I'd made to myself: for each bonus story awarded by the city, the maximum story height will increase by 1 and the maximum building height by 10 feet. Just reminding us that, again, according to my notes, that we had talked potentially 12, potentially 14. I think we did stick with 10, but I think we did talk about potentially 12 or 14.
Okay, actually, I had something on this same table now that I got my notes in the wrong order, but which is quite a bit more substantial, I think, but directly related to yours, which is that the row for maximum building height seems much too low. I'm not quite sure how we got to these numbers. So in M4, the maximum building height is 60 feet for a 6-story building. So that's assuming you have not earned any bonuses. You can go 6 stories, 60 feet. If you do earn all the bonuses, you can go 10 stories and 100 feet. Well, the MSU FCU building, it's 7 stories. After 6 stories, at the top of the 6th story, it is 90 feet, 8 inches tall compared to the 60 feet that they would be allowed for 6 stories. It seems as though this is quite out of sync with what builders are trying to build their stories to. And then I'd also point out, if you move over to the M3 column, notice that it has a limit of 4 stories and 55 feet. So its height limit is only 5 feet less, and yet that's for 4 stories. And then finally, just another example, the MSU FCU building in its total height is 105 feet. That's above the 100 we're allowing with a bonus, and it's only 7 stories tall.
Right, and these are just my notes from the sort of in that same line. I had made a note to myself that, again, going by current zoning, 8 stories and 112 feet. Do those numbers sound right? That comes out to 14 feet per story. So maybe that's where my note regarding 14 feet is. Again, we had talked about increasing that number. I don't know that we'd locked into a different, better thought, but my notes say, actually, I'm looking at them now, and I see 11, 12, and then 14.
And I don't know whether to actually use the credit union building as an example. You might remember I asked them at the meeting about their unusual floor heights, which are significantly higher than any other building that we've approved in the last 6 or 8 years downtown, and probably than any other building. And it appears that it's because it's an office building that they felt they needed those higher. That's kind of what I got from their answer, to provide the kind of office space that they might be able to rent. I assume they're going for a Class A office space or their rental. And
Chris, would you repeat your numbers again? So just so I got a note regarding height and number of stories, floors for the MSU FCU?
Yes, at 6 stories, their building is 90 feet, 8 inches. So it's averaging more than 15 feet.
Okay, there we go. Thank you.
Those, and then it adds another 14 feet for the 7th. The actual story heights, their ground story is 18 feet.
Right.
The second one is 16'8", and I believe the remaining ones are 14 each. So 14 is their lowest story height throughout the building.
Okay, thanks.
And so yet again, I don't have suggested numbers to go in here.
Would you like Dave and I to talk this over and come back and make a proposal?
Sure.
All right, we'll do that.
Yeah, I think this one's probably more crucial than sort of parking fenestration.
And then, so I think it's the M4 and M3 are the ones that seem questionable. M2 and M1 look reasonable to me. We're not allowing bonuses there. M2 is allowing, if you average it out, it would be 12.5-foot stories. And the M1 is actually allowing 15 or more feet per story, if you look at that.
Sure.
It's very generous. But I guess we're not really concerned about the height of 2 or 3 story buildings. So Shall we move on?
Yes.
On page 20, let me find this. Footnote number 2. The very first phrase, for interior and non-corner lots only. What is the difference between those two? I can't figure it out. To me, they seem synonymous. Would you ever have an interior lot that was not on the corner or vice? Actually, I guess that, or I'm sorry, that would be on the corner.
I'm looking for, the only situation I can think of, Chris, I'm looking for the graphic for it, where they had an interior corner, call it. And I thought that, there we go. It's the only potential, situation. On page 17, we've got that graphic that shows, actually it specifically says it's not a block corner. So I guess this is what I was thinking, but there's that, what I'll call an interior corner. I don't know what you want to call that. Anyway, less than 180 degrees or less than 90 degrees. Do you see where I'm talking? Page 17. This is a graphic we've seen repeatedly, but it specifically says it's not referred to as a block corner. So
Yeah. In addition, what it's talking about, it's not really, the footnote 2 is not really talking about the corners themselves. It's talking about the lots. So that diagram on page 17 is pretty clearly a corner lot.
Yes.
Even though it has something that looks like a corner that would not be considered a corner.
And just to clarify that we're not, let me take a look before we're not talking about a place that might be intersected by an alley. Would that be it? I'm just sort of thinking out loud here as to why the both of those are included there.
I can't remember if I searched for this. I think I did, and I couldn't. I'm looking for other uses of interior lot. I think we have it defined in our general code. Yeah, I don't find another reference to interior. And I'm almost certain we don't have another occurrence of non-corner.
All right, again, just sort of throwing out at the thought here. If interior lots defined in the general code, then that makes sense to me. If left in its own, and you refer to an interior lot, sort of just absent zoning language, could that not be considered the portion of the lot that's sort of removed from the property line? That is to say, it's sort of the center of the lot, the interior of the lot. Again, I don't think that's what's intended here. I'm wondering if by saying interior and non-corner, trying to clarify the fact that you're talking about a property that has only street frontage, only its front property line that actually runs along the public right of way.
That is what it means.
Right. But we might talk about the interior of a lot. You would be talking about, again, I don't know how to describe it any other way except to say, if you're on that particular page, in this case, we're calling it the private open area, but the sort of the center of the lot, the interior portion of the lot, the part of the lot that's not butting up against any property line. You might call that the interior of the lot. Again,
right. I understand what you're saying.
Zoning wise.
I understand what you're saying, but I think those are two clearly different phrases to me. If you say the interior of a lot, that is very different than an interior lot.
There we go. Yep.
So I don't really see the confusion there.
Oh, no, I'm just offering a potential, explanation as to why both of those might be included there. So if, for instance, if you just said for interior lots only, it might be thought that you meant the sort of the central portion of the lot. I think you could get away with saying non-corner lots and be pretty clear about it. Usually we refer to those as interior lots.
Right. That's the phrase I would have gone with and left out the non-corner. But I don't know, is this another one, Darcy, where you and Dave could look
Yeah,
at
we
this?
can look at that.
What's that?
We'll look at that for you
Yeah.
and make a recommendation.
And perhaps see what our existing code has for that and maybe stick with that terminology.
My eye just caught a little tiny typo on note number 5 on that page. Just the comma should be inside the quotation on the word footprint.
Thank you.
I think, just a minute, let me find something. I think we have that same thing we just talked about, the interior and non-corner. I think it shows up in, yeah, it's also on page 30, footnote number 3. It's exactly the same provision, but applied to the residential zones rather than the mixed use. My next one, I have a couple on page 28.
Cindy, 21. 22. I'm looking to see if I seen you shaking your head or nodding. 23. Whoops.
Oh, I'm sorry. Hold on a minute.
That's fine.
I have one other one on page 20 I overlooked.
All right.
Let me get back to it. And I just wanted to clarify this. I think I understand what it's doing, but it's back in that same footnote number 2. It says, it talks about the setback line being reduced to 12 feet where a street wall. And then it says minimum 6 feet in M4, M3, or M2, and minimum 5 feet in M1. If you look at the preceding page, the requirements for street walls, they are actually 1 foot lower. Now, is this trying to require it to be 1 foot higher when it's used to move the parking setback line? Is that the reason that it's 1 foot higher? It's not quite clear, or if it's a discrepancy.
Probably a discrepancy.
In any case, maybe this is what your thought was, Chris. It probably doesn't belong there anyway, but in the preceding table or a preceding footnote in the preceding table. Sorry if I stole your thunder there, but it just struck me as that this is one of those where if you change it in one place and you don't change it in another place.
Exactly.
Right. So if we do want it to be higher when it's used as a parking screening, then it should say it on page 19, right? It would say minimum 4 feet, except when used, et cetera, then 5 feet. Or so what is our intent here? I didn't go back and look. I assume this has probably been in there since the original draft. And I can see that maybe it is trying to require a higher wall if you're putting the parking behind it.
I'm assuming that's why, now that I look at it. 4 feet wouldn't do the job as well.
Yeah, although I'll also point out that if you were in the M1 district and someone put in a 4-foot wall, that would not be subject to the fenestration requirement because that kicks in at above 4 feet. So if we require a 5-foot wall, then automatically then 40% of that would have to be fenestration. Which one screens parking better? A solid wall that's 4 feet tall or a 5-foot wall that's 40% fenestration?
Wow. Just for ease of eventual enforcement, I'm inclined to think that they ought to be kept the same regardless if there's parking or not. Say, for instance, it gets built at 4 feet and there's no parking and someone wants to reintroduce parking later, then they would have to either build it taller or punch holes in it. Is that so? Or build it taller and punch holes in it?
Yeah.
That
would apply only in M1. That's the only place they could make it 4 feet.
But if it starts at 5 feet and then again, parking is introduced at some point later behind it, the height would have to be increased. But at that point to 6 feet.
That one would already have required 40%.
Right, it would already be fenestrated.
But if you increase the height, then theoretically you could need additional fenestration.
Right, and I wonder if that's the point where you put that, and a different material up on top, like the one example with the brick on the bottom and the look like iron or some sort of metal, additional height on top of that. I'm of a mind to think that those ought to be kept the same. And I actually think probably 5 and 4 are the right answers rather than 6 and 5.
I think I'd be fine with that. So we would eliminate the higher requirement for when it's used as a parking screen.
That's my thinking.
And so where are we moving this language to? Under the privacy fence?
In this case, we would just remove where it says the footnote on page 20 for interior and non-corner lots only. We have to decide what to do about that. But then just say the parking setback line is reduced to 12 feet where a street wall with canopy trees planted on, etc. It would simply remove the parenthetical phrase that talks about the minimum 6-foot and 5-foot heights, right?
Right, but it says, it doesn't, in 4E, it just says any street wall above 4 feet in height shall meet the fenestration. So where are we calling out that it's required to be 5 feet?
That's already there. It's on page 19.
Okay.
Under the height table for mixed use.
Got it.
And then there's a similar one for the height table for residential uses a few pages later.
Great, I see now.
All right, now my next one is on page 28. So I think Dan had something.
Just a sec. I'm just typing my notes. No, I was actually going through 22. Cindy, stop me if you've got any notes. 23.
I have a really minor one. It's on both page 19 and page 29. It's just repeated. It's just a stylistic thing. We italicize the phrase rise over run in both footnote 5 on page 19 and footnote 6 on page 29. Seems like sometimes we're putting these kinds of things in quotation marks. I'm not sure why this one is italicized. Is that what we want?
I would not italicize this.
Nor would I.
Yep, I wouldn't either.
That's a common enough phrase,
Yes.
and we're not making a definition out of it.
Right.
Okay. So page 20, 21, 22, 23, 24. Oh, I've got a note on 25. I don't know that there's any way that this can be done, Darcy. I'm happy to, you're the expert in whatever graphic program you're using here, but I see that the remnant of the old dotted lines, the 45-degree dotted lines, are still on this page. They're not labeled, so they might not be confusing, but you can see that at the building, the one that's set back further, that's sort of got two towers at the end. It's got the remnant of the old 45-degree, what would we call that, setback angle, setback plane, are still in place here. And it might very well be something that you were given a JPEG or a PIC file or something, and it's just too hard to erase it.
Yeah, I can't erase it, but we can see what we can do about getting it amended through the consultant. They might be willing to just do that and send us the graphic back.
That it's not labeled, I think, helps, because it's still there, and it may be just sort of demonstrating that the building that's on the right indeed sits well underneath that 60-degree setback plane. But it just, it's a remnant of an old graphic, and if it could be removed, that would, I think that would be better. But again, it's just a thought.
To me, it seems okay. I mean, it'd be
there you
fine
go.
to remove it, but I agree with your secondary comment there, Dan, that it almost illustrates that that part of the building is below the required line.
Yeah, then.
Leave it?
Yeah, sure. Okay, again, it was a note to myself that I remember we had talked about two different setback planes depending on where it was located on the lot.
We all know it was put in there for a different purpose, but I'm not sure other people would assume that.
Page 26. I've got a couple of notes here, but I think they're just sort of to remind me what we were thinking of. Hold on for just a sec. One of them has to do with the green building. Just a note that if and when, or that's sort of the adoption date, and that there is indeed an East Lansing Policy Resolution 2019-01.
Yes.
Because that'll become part of this. And then the other one is just a sort of a reminder to myself of what the existing situation is under significant public benefit. So I don't have any comment. It's just to remind me what's currently the situation. Page 27. As I see the numbering, item G should actually just be item F.
Yes, sir.
Okay. All right, page 28, Chris.
Just a minute. Well, okay, first of all, the 4 bulleted descriptions have changed now, and they don't match the examples anymore. I'm not sure what to do about it. The 4 bulleted descriptions used to include the words townhouse and cottage and so forth. I don't have the exact. For example, the R5 was townhouse, small apartment. And now they've been changed to just say residential use, etc. Yet all of the examples refer to the old language of small apartments, townhouses, cottages. I was pretty comfortable with the old wording. I had gotten used to the townhouse, apartment, cottage, and they helped me keep track a little bit better of what those are. I'm wondering if anyone else feels that way or.
Add it back in.
I'm looking at my notes here, and what the primary change that we had asked for and that has been incorporated is that we up to, that previously we had said, say for instance, in R5, we'd said townhouse, small apartment, 4-story, but the reality is it's 1 to 4 story, I guess, and that's been changed and that's been picked up. I'm just offering, perhaps because this zone used to be called what was it? It wasn't called residential, right? It was called TH/SA, or yeah, that's what it was, right?
Yeah.
Right.
And that sort of changing, simplifying, and I think the right changing it from THSA frontage to residential frontage is the right thing, but the descriptors don't bother me. Although, to be fair, on my notes, I do have them crossed out, so we must have talked about that at one point, but bringing them back in doesn't, I think that you're right, Chris. It does sort of adds a certain amount of sort of, I don't know, editorial flavor to what these different, the feeling of these different uses is. Are you good? Yeah, I think bringing it back in is fine. And it sounded like, I saw Cindy nodding, I think, so maybe that, yeah.
So add the townhouse and cottages back into the top language.
That does raise the question of what do we do about the names for them? Because they now say R2, R3, R4 instead
Right.
of THSA and so forth. So that would,
And I think that's why we removed them.
yeah, so that would be sort of out of sync with the abbreviated. But another thing I noticed is the R2 in there, wondering if that's going to confuse people, confuse it with our existing R2 residential zone.
And R3.
Oh, yeah, right. Although we do have another, we now have an M1 in the form-based code, and we have a manufacturing M1 district in our.
Given that this is a different portion of the code, I think I don't know. I think it's a manageable conflict.
Probably, yeah.
I would actually see what staff thinks about that.
But then that leaves the question of if we go back to the townhouse small apartment wording, are we okay with the R5, R4 instead of THSA? I think I am.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
I am.
Yes.
It seems to me that we're talking about, actually I don't even know what is it M? Yeah, so we're talking about mixed use and residential. And it seems to me pretty clear that you can lock onto those different ideas. That the THSA, I always found to be a bit, I don't know, excessive, I guess. It's sort of, if you know what those letters mean, it makes it for a good description. But it seems to me a bit much to have to try to talk about. It's just as easy to talk about R5, and in that case you're talking about more intense residential use.
Right, but we are agreeing to put the wording back in there so that the first bulleted line would say townhouse small apartment or whatever it used to say. Is that correct?
Yeah, and I think it's just, again, it just adds a little bit of flavor that, somebody that's thinking about that, they're talking about potentially a 4-story townhouse as opposed to a 4-story detached residential unit.
Right, and that would be very compatible with our existing code where we say that like B2 is our, what do we call it?
Oh, right.
I can't think of the word, retail.
Yes.
we have word descriptions that don't necessarily match the letter.
There you go.
Like B1 is.
Can I just raise a minor point here on the way those bullets are kind of styled here? I'm not sure why we have hyphens in residential use in the first two, or why we have hyphens in the second two, the last two bullets, 2-story is hyphenated.
Yeah,
Oh.
I noted that. And in addition, we have both.
We have
use-
subject word agreement problem in the first and second bullet also. And, you know, we have residential use that it should be allows in the first and second bullet as opposed to allow.
Well, yeah, notice that the third one says uses.
Exactly, yeah, exactly.
The first one said uses originally, it would have made sense that allow.
Exactly.
but-
Exactly. It's kind of a little clunky stylistically, that whole bulleted section with hyphens and verb tense, subject verb agreement issues. Lack of parallel structure. Sorry.
I agree with those changes.
Okay.
One way to handle the verb, it says that allow, if that were changed to allowing, then you don't really have that issue. It could be either single or plural. Use
Yeah.
allowing limited commerce, or uses allowing limited commerce.
Yeah, either way, just make it agree.
Okay, got it.
You good there? 28. Page 29.
Looks like my next one is all the way to 48.
All right, so page 30. I'm just looking for any notes here. Stop me, Cindy. I'm looking at my screen, so if you have something, speak up.
I'm slipping through here. I don't think so.
Okay, 31, 32, 33, 34, 35, 36. I have a thing here. And I think we talked about this before. I'm just, page 36, the second line of the table, general street curb right of way, 10 feet wide to 14 feet wide. Table says 5 feet minimum, but the graphic on the next page, 506B3C, 506B3 indicates, it's so small, but indicates 5 or 6
25.
preferred, or 5.5 feet minimum, 5.5 feet minimum.
We did change that on that second page under 3C, where it now says no dimension of the soil surface for any street tree area may be less than 5.5 feet unless the tree lawn is less than 5.5 feet. That's how we reconciled those. But you're right, the diagram still shows, the diagram is showing that the basic standard is 5.5 feet minimum, but
Mhm.
C allows the exception to that if the tree lawn is less than 5.5 feet.
So if there's an established tree lawn, you're not going to move the sidewalk or reduce the width of the street. Would it be enough to just change it in the table to 5.5 feet on page 36?
Well, I don't think it meant an established tree lawn. I think actually what it meant in C is unless the minimum tree lawn width is less than 5.5 feet. It was intentionally trying to leave that minimum on page 36 as it was. You're suggesting making that larger, right?
Or well, yes, I guess. And that would be I think that would be the simple answer, but I do remember we had talked about this before. I just that, if there's a disconnect or do you think that it's enough that it's explained in footnote or 3C that is enough to explain the discrepancy between the table and the graphic?
Maybe not now. I mean, I was the one who brought this up a few meetings ago, and that's why it was changed in C to point out that it could be less. But now looking at the diagram, I think you're right, that the diagram by itself wouldn't necessarily lead you over to read C and realize there's an exception. But when we talked about it, we kind of agreed when the right-of-way is only 10 feet, which is what that second row in the table on page 36,
Yes.
Adding 6 more inches to the tree lawn width is taking a perhaps noticeable amount away from the rest of the sidewalk. So
Right. I guess that's a good point, and probably one that you'd already considered, but it's only just coming to me now, is that, yeah, you're actually dealing with the 10-foot width, not so much the individual tree width, but you've got 10 feet you're working with overall.
right,
You want to have that sidewalk at 5 feet. So by definition, if it's in a 10-foot wide, I don't know, what are we calling it? Tree lawn sidewalk.
right away.
Thank you. Yeah, there you go.
If it were 14, it would be no big issue to
Exactly.
add another 6 inches to the tree lawn, but
Sure.
is it, I guess that graphic is probably one that would also be difficult to edit.
No, I can edit that.
I don't know if it would be possible to, on the graphic, put 5 to 5.5
Yeah, there you go.
foot minimum.
I think that would help. I mean, even above, the one above it even says 6 feet's preferred, but it doesn't indicate that it's obligatory. I think 5 to 5.5 feet minimum is the right answer there. And what you're talking about is only the ones that currently read horizontally, not the one that reads vertically, because that could be, there's the one at the very top right.
So you're talking about redoing the graphic, not the table on
Yep.
36. So do we keep the table on 36 the same or do the 5.5?
I think Chris is reminding me of why that was the way it was.
Okay.
And I think absolutely that my simple answer is actually not quite so simple anymore. So I'm just going to delete that note there. And then I agree that changing just the two dimension strings at the top of the, they're actually, what is that? The connected soil trench graphic.
Yes, and change both those sides to 5 to 5.5 minimum.
And as Dan said, only the two at the top, not the
Right.
one that's specifying essentially the length of the, but now that Dan reads that caption, I'm wondering, connected soil trench, is that really a helpful term down there?
You're in World War I.
It's contrasting, I guess, with the one above, which is showing an isolated tree, which is a little bit of an odd phrase, I think, to a lot of us. But are those more a common technical landscaping term, or?
I mean, we do we refer to it as a trench, I believe, in the urban design manual, but I'll have to look to see what other terms are used with it.
I like the term in that second graphic, immediately above the caption on the left, it says continuous tree lawn. And to me, that makes a little more sense.
I like that too.
As opposed to connected soil trench. So you have isolated tree at the top for the top graphic, and then continuous tree lawn for the second one as a possibility.
I think what it's differentiating is that on the one side, it's showing there's a soil trench connected all the way across, but there's not a lawn, and one's a continuous tree lawn. Does that make sense?
True, I do see the distinction between the two. I was trying to come up with one
Term that makes sense for both.
yeah, other than connected soil trench. But
Hi, David.
yeah, if you can come up with something.
We'll look at that.
And while we're on that page, I just confirm, I didn't see it. Maybe I didn't look hard enough, but oh, wait a minute. My note here is tree list is in at 508. Hang on. I just want to make sure that the tree list is indeed, it's referred to by, what's it called? Street trees and public space. Sorry, I'm talking out loud or speaking or thinking out loud again. I just want to make sure that there is indeed a tree list established and that we've got reference to it.
What page are you on?
I'm on page 37, footnote or B3E. It's just that it refers to a tree list, and I think that we'd said that there was one. That it doesn't need to be incorporated into this language, but that by reference, there we go. It's actually at section 508, which starts on page 39. Again, maybe this was just a note for me to assure myself that it's all sort of the ends are getting closed up. That's all sorry, page 37, 38.
We stay on 37 just for a minute.
Of course.
I
Sorry.
mean, street space is one of our defined words, small caps, hyphenated, except on C. It's not hyphenated, it's one word. Do we want to keep it consistent?
Yes, please.
Yes, I'm sorry. What was it again, Cindy?
Just the word street space in C
I
on,
see. C and 506 are different, I see. So
Yeah.
are we hyphenating it?
I think we should keep it the same. I didn't pick it up anyplace else, but it is on that heading.
Thank you.
And your
Yeah,
point
actually-
about it is a lowercase capital. Is that what we lower capital?
Right, it's a defined term, but
Thank
I don't know that we're doing that in,
Not in the titles.
like if you look up at the title on 506,
Mm-hmm.
it's hyphenated there, but not on C.
Right. Thank you. Good catch.
All right, page 30. Sorry, 38, I think. Yes. 39, 40, 41. I'm sorry, I've got a note for myself here. We had talked about this before, and I think David was going to pick away at it. I don't think it's terribly urgent. 601C regarding historic properties. Generally speaking, only the properties that are, we've talked about this before. Again, maybe this just needs to be sorted out. It's only really the properties that are located in a local historic district that should probably receive the benefit, I'll say, of review by the Secretary of the Interior standards. The others wouldn't hurt, but the state and the national register don't really apply. It would be good if those standards were applied, but it's not obligatory. Right. And again, I think it's just that, again, it was just a note to myself that sort of needs to be.
So take the state or national registration out.
I think that isn't there a shall in there? Yeah. So that, in the case of sort of it's a shall for the local district, but perhaps could or should, or just remove it from the state or national? Because I don't think it's a terrible idea to remind people that it would be nice to handle those properties sensitively, but there's no obligation to follow the Historic District
I
Commission
see. Yes.
directions on those. Page
So what-
51.
So how are we ending that?
Sorry. Oh, sorry. I mean, I don't know. Maybe it would require some discussion that there probably aren't too many properties that are located that are listed on the National Register that aren't also listed in the local register. But the reality is that if we're talking about shall, it should say, all right, I'll offer this. For properties listed in the state or National Register of Historic Places, actually, I'm going to come back to that. For properties located within a local historic district, the Secretary of the Interior standards for rehabilitation shall supersede this avenue form district.
So we're just taking out from state to within.
If it's a matter, yeah, because we don't want to introduce language that sort of is vague or not.
Right.
Because the reality is that, yes, that would be great if those other properties receive the benefit of additional review, but that's not obligatory. So, yeah, I think in that case, sure.
Can I ask I don't fully understand what this provision is doing now that I read it. Is it perhaps saying that our form-based code standards cannot be applied in a historic district? It cannot require them to make these changes? Is that right? Or
No, it's saying that the rehabilitation standards supersede. So I would assume that means that anywhere where they conflict, is that?
That's how I would read it as well.
I have a question. Is this just a true statement, or is this an expression of our intention?
I think it's a true statement.
Then why do we have to say anything? It just is what it is.
That's a good point.
I mean, we don't say, we don't make statements about which laws might supersede our code anywhere.
And I think the reason I personally thought it should be in there is just because the community has consistently brought up the concern that we have these borders drawn around historic district areas, and we can't do that because we can't change, you know what I'm saying? These have
I
to
do.
go. And so having that in there, just kind of, we can refer to that, just saying that that's understood, and the intent isn't to override the historic district standards. I think it's more or less just saying that we're not getting rid of them. We're working within the boundaries. So it's more of a political thing than a really need to have it in there.
And that makes a lot of sense to me. It's just that this reads like more legalistic than like an expression of our community support for our historic district.
It does. And that's probably because I stole it from another document. So
Oh.
Hang on. Do we not, though, specifically say in this document, and maybe it's just the other way of looking at it, that where the zoning ordinance and the form-based ordinance conflict, that the form-based ordinance supersedes?
Oh, yeah, we gotta go back
we
to
do
that.
say that in the administrative section.
what was your question, Dan?
So I'm wondering, do we not
say
say
that?
at some point in this document that where there's a conflict between, it's not really underlying zoning anymore, but there's the general zoning, say, and the form-based code, that the form-based code, the avenue form, supersedes, that where there's a
Right, we do
conflict.
say that.
Yes.
Where is that? Does anybody remember?
That's
I
in the
don't.
administrative section, the very
Yeah.
beginning.
It's in
Yeah,
201A.
I'm looking for it here.
201A on page 5. And it reads, when applying
Yeah.
the regulations of the form district, if regulations elsewhere within this ordinance conflict or appear to conflict, the regulations of this section shall apply.
For right there, can we just place with the exception of the historic district where the local historic district, the Secretary of Interior standards for rehabilitation shall supersede? Something to that effect?
Well, that does raise an interesting question because the part we're looking at right now is specifically architectural standards. So at some
Right.
point, someone made a choice of putting this in that section rather than putting it for the code as a whole. But it's written as though it's for the entire Avenue Form District code. So in that sense, it seems as though it would belong in a different place than the place that you're suggesting.
Right. Well, with the historic or the Secretary of Interior standards, so they are all architecturally related. But I think it makes more sense putting it in the administrative section.
I still have a question. I don't really grasp the meaning of this. Can someone give me one or two examples of where this might arise? And what would there be about the Avenue Form District that would require something? And then these other regulations would require something different or would not allow that? Or how could this come up in our community?
So I'll give a potential example, and I'm sort of flipping back to, I'm going back to the building form standards. Hang on, I'll get you the page in just a second. So let's just work off the residential, and we'll page 30, for instance. And then this is presuming that you're working with an existing building, which is going to be the case in nearly every situation we're dealing with. Generally speaking, if somebody were to do an addition to a building within the historic districts, the hope, the expectation would be that addition would be placed on a non-character defining elevation, so side or back. Whereas if they're going to be doing an addition, and particularly those that are, remember that sort of the larger, the stated greater than 20%, that we would hope that they actually hold to the required building line, and thereby running cross purposes. The hope that a required building line, a common required building line along the street is established, would run counter to the typical practice in historic districts of sort of holding that front elevation as non-touchable or touched lightly, so that any addition that were made would be preferred in a historic district to be at the back and not at the front. Whereas we're asking generally that when there's a significant change being made, that actually holds to that front required building line. I would call it a property line.
Okay, but can I comment on that?
Of course.
That example gets into a much, much bigger issue, I think, that if someone in a residential zone of these, form-based residential wants to add more than 20% to their house, I believe you're correct that our modification standards show that they would have to meet the required building line.
Correct.
That is a huge issue for almost any property. Most people would want to add the 20% on the back. And yet this is going to say, even if you're going to add it on the back, somehow you have to meet the required building line, right? Now, I'm not talking about historic properties. I'm talking about any property.
Right. No,
it's a major issue that we have with all the non-conforming properties that are going to be created by this code.
Absolutely. No, and I think that think that we've all understood that sort of when this particular zoning is enacted, nearly every property that's in the area well, that's not true. Because there's certainly properties along Grand River and on Albert that hug the building or hug the required building line. But as we start to get back into the neighborhoods, back into, that's primarily Bailey, the properties that are set back from the front property line now have a required building line that doesn't match what is sort of expected from this code. I'm not disagreeing with you. That's a problem that we've acknowledged all along.
Okay, so sticking with your example then, if
Right.
someone wanted to make a 25% addition to their house in one of these newly rezoned areas,
Right.
if they were not in the historic district,
Right.
as it's written now,
Right.
they would somehow have to they would have to meet the required building line. Is that correct?
I'm looking at table 20 or 201, 21 or more % building area with additional foundation required. That is to say, a major modification. The expectation would be that all of the standards of the form-based code would be met. There's X's in all of the columns of that row.
Under placement in particular.
No, I'm actually going back to administration. But yes, ultimately, yes. And so that refers back to placement. Yes.
Yes. Okay. If that same if the same thing happened in a historic district, then that property would not be required to meet the required building line because of this clause that we're talking about right now?
I think that's what we're suggesting.
Okay, that's kind of the answer I was looking for as to what the impact of this is.
Right. And then a good deal, in as much as we're talking about potentially dialing this back from the residential, from only the mixed use portion of this code. And so a lot of I'd have to look at the map a little more closely, but much of the historic district is actually in the residential area of the form-based code regulating plan. So by dialing it back, it avoids that, sort of the broad application of what is an unusual zoning tool till a later date. I mean, I'm of a mind to think that there are ways to make modifications to historic buildings that are appropriate. I mean, but it's it's up to the individual, either owner or and then ultimately, I suppose, to the Historic District Commission and the person that's ultimately going to be building it as to how that's done. But yes, I think that what you said is exactly right, that there would be effectively a waiver to that that particular section of a major building modification if it's in the historic districts.
And so similarly, this would apply to the architectural standards in certain ways. Can you think of an example of how that would I'm still trying to grasp this.
Sure. Tell you what, David had a question too. Let me think see if I can't think of because I'm looking at the table and going to jump back to the building form standards and see if I can't think of
although, maybe it's getting a little late here. Maybe I don't need to continue this.
Well, I have a question. I'm remembering that we had a representative from the Historic Commission at one or two of our meetings. I'm sure that this is something that would be a hot topic in that group.
Yes.
We can't resolve this today. I mean, I think there are a lot of issues that come up with this, including what's going to be the scope of this when it finally gets rolled out. Is it going to include the residential neighborhoods or not? So is there any way that we could reach out? Was it Diane?
Diane.
Maybe even just kind of even raise the issue or ask her to attend or join us for a discussion about this, or before it gets rolled out, kind of at least get some input?
Idea.
That's a great idea.
Go ahead, David.
A couple of things come to my mind on this issue. One, I think the exemption for properties in the historic district are just for the purpose that if it's stylistically or form, whatever the current resources, can't really meet the intent of the form-based code and it's a valuable historic resource, there's no sense in trying to push it in that direction, right? It needs to be consistent with itself. So I think that's why the exemption is there. So you don't force something on a resource that changes its character to the extent that it's kind of violates its own resource principles, right?
Sure.
So I think one way to maybe deal with this that is a little bit different perspective is, I think there's only one or two areas where the form-based district and the historic district overlap, and it's on the edge of the form-based district, right? And so one way to deal with this is just to adjust the form districts to remove those from the district, and then you don't have that conflict. Now you might still have a conflict with individual resources that are on the thematic district, so they're individual properties outside of a district. So you might still have an issue with those, but so that's one way to deal with it. Might be an easier way to do it, but you might still need an exemption for those resources that you know are still within the district.
Right, what we refer to as the landmark sort of
Yeah,
isolate. Yeah,
right.
exactly.
Yeah, I understand why you suggest that. I do see a problem with it though, in that if you look at the way the new zoning is planned on the regulating plan, it starts with intense uses downtown, then goes to the most intense residential close to downtown, and then gradually steps down to less intense form-based code. If you take the historic district areas out of the form-based code entirely, I think it's going to disrupt that perhaps pretty badly. I think we'd have to look at that progression of the form-based code.
Well, we could, but if it's a district, we could, but if it's a district that we are already going to be exempting from it, they're going to, you know, I mean, I don't know that I see that changing a whole lot. If it's a protected district, you know, the requirements of the Secretary of Interior and the historic district guidelines aren't going to let it change a whole lot anyway. So I don't see that district changing much, just the sheer fact that it's already been protected from change already. So one other point I wanted to make on the exemption issue, if we do exempt it from the form-based code standards, now there are still will be in place the Secretary of the Interior standards and the historic district standards, but beyond that, what I guess it would revert back to if it's still in the form-based district, is exempted from the form-based requirements in terms of site plan setbacks and all of that kind of thing. What does apply other than the Secretary of the Interior standards?
Well, I don't know.
It's still in a district, but you removed the requirements. So other than historic district standards, there would be no other standards that apply, right?
Well, that was getting at what my question was. I don't think you're really removing those requirements. You're exempting them from ones that conflict. And it's not quite clear to me which of those would conflict with the historic district standards. That doesn't seem like a simple question.
No, nor is there an easy answer to that, because, sorry, Darcy, but generally speaking, the Historic District Commission is placed in a position where they're authorized to determine the character defining features of the building and the site. And so that sort of the local group effectively determines those things that need additional scrutiny or protection. And it might very well be something having to do with siting or placement or setbacks. Darcy?
I just wanted to remind everyone, whether it's right or wrong, the reason why these boundaries have been shown over some of the historic district areas through the comprehensive planning process. This was a constant and ongoing conversation about some of the historic districts that maybe the lines could be modified without something overlying these boundaries, to give the community some comfort that any redevelopment there wouldn't turn into student ghetto type redevelopment. There would be no political will to shift the boundaries. So the purpose of putting this overlay on the historic district boundaries was to, in the future, if there's a political will to look at some of these areas for changing the boundaries, they would have more comfort with knowing that the form-based code is overlaying these properties, and it wouldn't just be the current zoning that we have now. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Makes a lot
I'm
of
not
sense.
sure that would give, you think that would give them comfort or concern, be a cause for concern?
I think it would be comfort. I mean, that was one of the big things that came up in the process when we had developers and historic. Diane Wing actually was in some of these meetings. Obviously, there are some areas of the city that are truly historic districts and need to be protected. But there's some other areas that they really outlived their historic quality. They've had things change way before we were able to control that, and may be better off creating more of these redevelopment boundaries that are closer to the existing historic districts like Bailey, to have a more positive impact on the existing historic districts, opposed to having this false historic district to prevent any changes, where what happens is it prevents any improvements.
Yeah, and for what it's worth, I think the avenue for that particular, those changes, so there's a provision in the Historic District Ordinance that permits the issuance of not a certificate of appropriateness, but what they call a notice to proceed. And there are 4 specific, now you don't have to meet them all. You have to meet one of the, like in zoning, right? That there are sort of, you have to hit a couple of things, and then there's a sort of a choice of filling, Chris, of the Zoning Board of Appeals. There's a couple of, like, maybe 4 different points, and if you meet one of them, the zoning variance is permitted. Well, I've presented to the Historic District Commission recently regarding this, that one of those provisions has to do with the retention of the resources not in the best interest of the entire community. And the way I read that, I didn't prevail in this particular case, but my argument was that if that the retention of that resource would not be in the best interest of the community if it ran counter with the comprehensive plan. So that, say the properties along, I'm going to just make up, this is an area I'm pretty familiar with, to say the 100, 200 block of Bailey, right up the street from me. They're cute houses, but they're sort of, in terms of density, they're underutilized. They're nice, but they're not spectacular. And I say that with all due respect to the people that live there, own them. That there's a possibility to apply provisions of the Historic District Ordinance to actually permit a demolition if indeed that the demolition or the lack of retention of the resource meets with the support of the greater community. And again, I think that is reflected in the way that the comprehensive plan is structured. So if the comprehensive plan suggests, no, really, those single family houses the city would be better served by replacing those single family houses with more dense, say, townhouses or apartments, that demonstrates to me the will of the people without having to go to a ballot referendum, without having to get city council to weigh in, that's the way that the city has determined how that land should be best used.
I noticed you prefaced your comments by saying you didn't prevail on this.
Oh yeah, it was one, but to be fair, I pitched that same idea to a colleague and they did prevail. So I think that the Historic District Commission is aware that in my case, the property was actually, no, it was on the edge of the district, but it was really closer to downtown. In their case, this is the corner of Bircham and I don't know the street, but the one that leads to the library, that where they're going to be, well, we looked at it in the planning commission, that where they're going to be building that sorority. Right. And so right now it's a cute little brick house, but that their argument was that comprehensive plan suggests that that area should be much more intensively used. And part of the argument that I provided to my colleague in front of the Historic District Commission was, you know, this is something the comprehensive plan is saying, hey, really, it's okay for you to issue this notice to proceed because it does meet with this particular point of the Historic District Ordinance. So it was the notice to proceed, that the idea of demolishing a historic building, there's actually a provision within the Historic District Ordinance that allows that if certain provisions are met, and that was one of them.
Well, this is clearly, I think, a sensitive issue. I'm not sure how that we can resolve it today, but it's definitely interesting.
Dave and I can come up with a couple options for that language, moving it, and we can decide to move it, change it, or remove it, whatever works. But we'll give some options and some rationale behind it.
Right.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting discussion. Do we exclude it specifically with language, or do we exclude it by not including it in the regulating plan?
Right.
It's just interesting.
And I think this will be a big topic when we take it to the entire planning commission. So,
Definitely.
right.
All right, so back to page 40. Anything else there? We know 41, 42. 43, 44. I can't remember where you said you were, Chris. 48, was it? 45, 46, page 47, page 48.
Yes.
Oh, there we go. Thank you.
Let me find it here. Yes, under D2 on that page, there's still a reference to general flex right at the beginning of that wording.
Oh, thank you.
And then I have a question. It almost seems though I raised this before, but I don't remember the answer. It down to the fourth line, it's requiring that a door shall not be recessed more than 4 feet behind their facade. And I'm wondering why. You know, if somebody wants to put in a 6-foot deep entryway, why would we not want to allow that? Or did I raise this question at a previous meeting, or did I just have?
So.
And I don't see it in my notes here either. I don't recall talking about that.
Yeah, I don't recall.
Okay, I had it in some earlier notes, and it must be one I didn't get to.
We talked about the recessed door, but I don't think we talked about it in that context, that it maybe should be less restrictive.
Unless someone has a good reason, I would rather see it less restrictive. I can't understand why we want to prevent that. I suppose it could be because that is part of the traditional look that this code was originally written to promote.
I think that you're right there. That we've I think wisely we've gotten away from that. The other potential is that, you know, at what point do you define, right? So if it's just a matter of, say, pushing the 2 doors back and then a 45-degree recess that comes back to the street, 6 feet, 8 feet, at some point, that required building line is now mostly void.
Oh, yeah.
You know, that also means that the proprietor loses storefront, you know, sort of valuable opportunity to display their wares. So,
yeah, I agree with that. And I don't think there would be many who would want to do that.
nor I.
But I'm also in favor of removing restrictions that I don't think contribute very much. If somebody wanted to do a dramatic, I think of it as being more dramatic if it's deeper.
Me too.
I would like to allow the few rare occurrences of that might happen.
You're sort of providing another tool to the toolbox or brush to the palette or whatever. Absolutely.
Should we remove that completely or add a less restrictive number?
I would rather remove it, but that's part of my consistent wish to remove a lot of the architectural standards. Increasing it would be better. I mean, better than leaving it as it is.
Mhm. What is the consensus?
I don't know.
I'm reading the text right now because it sounds to me then if that's the case, Chris, that, and again, going back to what the original language would seem to support is this 45-degree angle, is that necessary?
Right.
Yeah, I think that is somewhat important. That's more functional to me.
Okay.
It guarantees that pedestrians walking out of the building they won't come up to a sort of a blind corner within the entryway, that
Okay.
they can see someone else who's about to pass by on the sidewalk. And
So you're just removing the shall not be recessed more than 4 feet.
That's-
So shall not be recessed more than 4 feet behind the facade gets removed and the language is clear then?
yeah, do not encroach into the right of way or required building line and shall have a clear view.
I think you're right that in that case, most people are thinking probably 4 feet, 5 feet, maybe as little as 3 so that the doors don't swing into the right of way. But if there's some reason to push it back a touch further, good catch.
So we're going to delete, not change.
Right.
Is that all on page 48?
Yes.
49? No issues with mechanical equipment standards. 50, 51.
No, 50.
Whoops.
It's getting so late. I hesitate to bring this up, but I'll see if I can do it quickly.
Chris, for what it's worth, the next is a different section, so it would make a good place to make a break if we're going to.
Yeah. D caught my attention because this came up with the credit union building. And I keep looking for interactions between the form-based code and current applications to think about what the results would be. So I wanted to point out that our current code says that this type of equipment must be screened to minimize noise, vibration, or visual impacts which affect adjacent properties, which to me is a somewhat subjective, especially the word minimize. One person might decide something was minimized and someone else might not think it was. I didn't think that the credit union had minimized their screening. Obviously others did. The new language says, I guess the key is must not be clearly visible from the street space. And that's defined pretty well. It's to me, it's not as subjective as our current language. However, I wanted to point out that it does not apply in an alley. So that's a difference. Our current code does not say where it's located. It has to be screened regardless of where it is. So that's a difference also. And I'm wondering if that's really what we intend. If you look at our current code, you could put certain kinds of equipment in an alley as long as they are I think it's 30 feet down the length of the alley from where it intersects with the street and not screen them at all. So I think that's a potential flaw in it.
I'm reading the definition of clearly visible street space.
Right, I believe that's where the 30 or 40.
40.
So you understand the scenario I'm talking about?
Yeah, but I'm not seeing the exemption for an alley.
Right, it's not mentioned.
Oh, okay, that's your point.
Oh, an alley, okay, an alley by definition is not part of the street space.
Right.
No, but so if it's set in an alley, and is further back than 40 feet, then it's okay.
Setback 40 feet from where the alley intersects the street.
Yes.
That's where clearly visible would be defined from.
Right. So you're saying that the alley is not street. So you couldn't walk up the alley and claim this is new street space. You have to be 40 feet from this alley edge. That doesn't apply because the alley is not actually there's no required building line at an alley.
Yeah.
Okay. Still reading. Yeah.
So to me, that seems like a flaw.
It should. Go ahead.
It seems to me that we want some screening even in alleys, don't we want?
Okay.
Or are we just giving up on them, that they are going to be purely mechanical and whatever goes there?
Darcy, go ahead.
Yeah, it's a good question. However, in an urban area, it is more difficult. We do have our alleys that we've gone through great lengths to beautify and make them usable for pedestrian traffic. So that's a good point. But how would we write that? Yeah, I think you're right, Chris. We probably do when you think about, like I said, some of the alleys that we've worked hard to beautify and that some that we may in the future. How do we do that without also preventing a location for that to occur?
I'm not sure. Again, just going back to what our current code says, it says that type of equipment must be screened to minimize noise, vibration, or visual impacts which affect adjacent properties. And again, it's not limited to location at all. It could be anywhere on your property, and it has to meet that requirement. I'm not quite sure how we could get that type of language, or if we want it to be that strict. As I say, in a sense, it's more strict. In another sense, it's more lenient because of the use of the word minimize, which can have a range of meanings.
Right.
And I guess I'll point out also our current one requires minimizing three things: noise, vibration, or visual impacts. The form-based code simply talks about clearly visible from the street space. It says nothing about noise or vibration. In that sense,
do you want Dave and I to come up with some language that kind of combines those two?
I feel as though that's what we need, and I wasn't quite ready to rewrite it myself.
Nope. We'll do that.
All right, I'm mindful of the time because I've got an 11 o'clock. Sorry, David, just a sec. Let's come back to this. Let's return back to page 50 when we have our next meeting. And then go ahead, David. And then there's no members of the public here as I can see. But we do you want to talk about the schedule, or can that wait till next time too, Darcy?
That can wait till next time.
Go ahead, David.
I'm good. I was going to have a comment about that screening, but given the time,
Go ahead. We've got
hold it for next time.
Are you sure?
Okay. So do we care about the location as long as it's screened and doesn't have an adverse impact from noise or vibration? I mean, do we really care? As long, if you can't see it, can't hear it, do we care? Going back to the intent of the whole form-based code, to give them some more flexibility about where these things are. The perfect example is the Abbott. There's no place to put it. They have 4 frontages. So not to say that where they put it was good, but that in a situation like that, they are very limited in where those things can go and still be serviceable and that kind of thing. But you know, if it were tucked into the building like MSU FCU had, but some kind of screen across the front of it, you'd never know it was there.
Sure.
Well, the form-based code as it's written, the form-based code as it's written now does not place any location requirements on it. They can put it wherever they want. If it's within 40 feet, you know, visible from this, clearly visible, then they have to screen it.
Behind and away from the required building line. So it'd have to be behind the required building. It'd have to be within the building then, in the case of the Abbott.
That's right.
Oh, yes. Okay, right. So what does the Abbott have that is?
Well, they're out. I mean, they're outside basically on the sidewalk.
What is there?
Electrical transformer boxes. I think there are 2 or 3 of them. Right there at Abbott and Albert.
Okay, so by our current code, those must be screened, correct?
Right.
I haven't really looked at the property, so.
Yeah, and I think that was something we probably missed through the process.
I mean, they are pretty much a special case where they take up an entire block. Is there some way to keep this requirement for other properties who have an alley or a side yard, but make an exception for a property that does not?
Yeah, we'll have to get creative in our wording to try to, yeah, we'll see what we can put together for you.
Yeah, obviously you're right about them, that this requirement would not work for them at all.
No.
Well, even for the Graduate, Center City, MSU, FCU, I mean, all of their options are very limited.
No, but those other 2 that you mentioned do have frontages that, I mean, they have sides of the building that are not required building lines.
Yeah, they have alleys.
I mean, that's where the credit union put theirs on something that is not a required building line. So they.
Right. But it would still need to be screened in a current code requirement. And here.
I'm not sure how far back it is. If it's 40 feet from the required building line, then it has no requirement at all in the form-based code.
Which usually isn't going to happen in a urban area, I imagine.
And in fact, I think you could read this to say that their transformer or whatever it is would not be clearly visible from the street space because of the way it's set into the building.
Okay, let's come back to this. We'll come back to page 50 when we meet again. The agenda.
I will have Rebecca send out a email about when you can meet next.
Yes, please.
Sounds good.
All right. Okay, everybody. We'll see you next Wednesday.
Thank
If
you.
not before.
Good progress.
Good job.
Thanks, everyone. We're getting there.
Yes,
Absolutely.
amazing.
Have a good one.
And I can say that
Hey,
was
see you soon.
the end of all of my comments
Oh.
until we get back to the administration.
Till we return, right?
All right. See you then.
All right. Bye-bye.
Stay well.